went to a real art museum for the first time a couple of years back. I felt kind of disappointed with myself because I wasn't very impressed. One of the women I was with during that trip, I was kind of following her around. She seemed like more of an art genius than I was, and she saw Rembrandt, and she just goes, "Oh my goodness, it's a Rembrandt. Guys, come look at this, it's a Rembrandt. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm standing 2 feet away from a Rembrandt." And I went over and it was like a bowl of flowers. I felt so disappointed in myself that I couldn't revere this art the way that everyone else did. So where does this idea, this myth of a solitary genius sitting alone creating art from their own brain come from? First, let's look at where artists came from by using the simplest analogy, probably the farthest back analogy, that of the cavemen. So think about the cavemen sitting around in their cave when one of them says, "You know what, you guys go out, hunt and kill the mammoth, bring home something to eat. I'm going to stay here and I'm going to paint a picture of the mammoth." Do you think the other cavemen were okay with that? The reasons that we see for ancient art and what it benefited their societies was usually religious purposes. If I paint the picture of us killing the mammoth, it'll be a message to the gods to allow us to kill this mammoth if we commemorate it on the wall. Or think about maybe the political and social interaction aspect. I'm going to paint this mammoth with the leader of the tribe killing it, so everybody knows he's the greatest, that it's his accomplishment. We see from here that the simplest and oldest analogy we can find for artists was them creating art for a purpose that benefited other people. Because otherwise no one was going to let them sit in the safe cave and paint instead of coming out and helping with the real work. Which brings us to the economic need that needs to be met in order to make art and luxury possible. Which is basically, before you can have art, you have to have all your basic needs met. You have to have shelter, food, and clothing. And then once you have those things and you don't have to worry about dying if you take any time off from work, then you can sit back and start to appreciate art and create art. So ancient cities were the first place where this really became prevalent. We see this in Athens. Athens had enough resources because of specialization of labor, the shared burden of work, that it meant they were able to create the ancient Greek theater in order to tell these ancient stories in a way that people could go and watch instead of working or, just listening to the stories. This was something that only the city was able to allow. Shakespeare's plays became accessible in London because people were able to pay maybe at most a day's wage to see the show. The trade-off became possible for them to have some entertainment instead of spending that day working and making enough money to survive. Because they were living in the city, they were able to have some excess money, have some excess time. This brings us to some of the ways that artists were supported in their days, that they were able to get something back for the art they created. Probably the earliest form was the aristocrats, who, the ones that had money, were able to pay artists, commission them for specific work they wanted done. And in this way, the artist was able to make their art and get something for it. The biggest patron of the arts was probably the church for the longest time, because they always wanted religious arts to be made. And so that was the easiest way for an artist to make money, was to make art for the church. The second way that artists could make money, and probably the most accessible way, was just the general market. And we see this in Shakespeare's time, that Shakespeare was in a market environment. He was creating plays for the public to come and see. The market was a way for artists to create what they wanted and then show it to the market. Maybe a lot of people would want to pay money. Maybe people liked it but didn't want to pay money. Maybe people just didn't like it. And you get a lot of feedback from that market audience, what people will actually ask you to bring to them in order for them to give you money back. And the third way that artists have been able to make money historically has been through institutional support, mostly the government historically. When the government says, in this area there's not a lot of art being produced, so we should subsidize the artists there, we should be able to, see what they're making and then just give them a wage for whatever they make, instead of kind of having this feedback loop that we see mostly in market but also in patronage, where the customer basically tells the artist, "This is what I want," and then the artist is able to give them what they want in return for money. Under institutionalized support, mainly the government, the artist just has to have arbitrary guidelines for if what they're creating is good, and then they'll be getting pretty steady support in return for that without a direct audience that their art is going towards. The main area that this solitary genius idea came from was from artists who lived in the patronage system, in the market system, and didn't like it, who said, "I want to be able to create what I want to create, and I don't want anyone telling me, oh, this isn't good, I don't want to pay for this, I don't think that you should be creating like this, I would pay for something if you made this." Getting all this feedback on how to change their art, how to make it more so that other people like it. And, that can be a very frustrating thing for artists, especially in the modernist art movement. this idea kind of arose from the artists that, you know, my art stands alone. And if you don't like it, it's probably because you don't understand it, not because it's not good. This is the biggest reason that this idea of having a solitary artist that, you know, can't be distracted or it's going to ruin their art came from. But is that idea really true? Historically, no. When we look back historically on what we herald as the great art of the centuries, you know, when we look back at Shakespeare's theater, we look back at the Greek theater, we look back at Charles Dickens' novels, we look back at painters, music, you know, any area where we have these great artists, even the ones that we consider to be solitary geniuses, we can find out that they actually lived in very commercial times. And a lot of the reasons for why their art was so popular was because it was created for a market. Shakespeare's theater, like I said, was entirely market-based, entirely for the audience, for pay from the audience. So he had to create something that the public was going to like. Everything that we see as the most famous, the paragon of genius, was created in that environment. Not in an environment where he was sitting alone, getting all of his money from a government support institution, and just being able to create whatever came out of his head. No, he had this feedback loop. A lot of the feedback did come from his own crew. One of his actors did much better playing kind of clown roles, while the new actor did a much better job playing kind of the tragic fool roles. And so his writing actually changed to meet the second actor's needs, to let that actor flourish, because, you know, who's famous in plays and shows? It's the actors, not the playwrights. But this shift created one of the token, recognizable aspects of Shakespeare's art, the character of the tragic fool, which is played upon in many of his plays. That's just one example of how feedback from the market and actually working with his crew instead of working by himself in the recesses of his own mind allowed him to create something that was going to be new and understood for generations as a genius work. So why is the market a good way to allow art to flourish? Well, think of it this way. Whenever we have a great output of creation, most of it's going to be bad, but some of it's going to be good. So we see that for any bit of genius that comes out of an era, it comes out of this great mass of creation. If you shrink that pyramid, it's going to be smaller trash, but smaller genius. Which is one of the reasons government regulation of the arts or of new medias often does not create better production, because it restricts the market. It means that less people are able to create. And if less people are creating overall, it means that less people who would be able to create genius works are getting into the pool of creation. And therefore, you know, there's less bad stuff being created, theoretically, but there's also less good stuff at the top, significantly less. And why is collaboration a good thing for what we think of as these solitary artists? Why should they be working with other people? Again, historically, we see that this does not harm the artist. Think about Casablanca. This is a movie that was, that is like the pinnacle of film. It's something that people connect with, and that is hailed as this great achievement. When you look into the history of how it was created, it was a mess. You know, they had like 9 different writers, as well as the producer and director contributing different aspects. The writers kept changing in the middle of the script, and up till, you know, a few months before the final screening, they didn't know how the movie was going to end. And so the last scene was kind of scribbled out quickly, and then they realized that one of the actors, who had already left because filming was done, was unable to come back. And so they had to completely cut down the last scene in order to give us the iconic line. It's the beginning of a beautiful friendship. But you see, it was just made from all of this mess and disorganization, and yet it's an incredible artistic work. So we see there that collaboration, even when it's not well planned out, it's not put together, can produce incredible artistic works. So what we know from this for the future is that when a new medium pops up and there's great artistic creation in that area, we tend to believe that if it's commercialized at all, if it's in a market environment, you know, like video games, created completely for an audience, completely for people to buy and play them, they can't be any good, you know, they're just gimmick. They're only for profit in order for these studios to get money to make more games. But historically, we can see that that's not a bad thing. Opening the market for people not only to create new forms of art within new mediums, but for the general populace to respond to that, to support them in return for creating something good that's going to benefit us, is something that has created some of the most famous art forms and works of art in the past. Continue to revere artists. That's okay. Just remember that just because something was created maybe by a team of people, or maybe in an environment where the artist was not sitting alone solitary, was actually getting feedback from an audience, doesn't mean the art is bad, and actually might make it a lot better.